Hello, I'm Commander Redacted and welcome to Bravo Squadron's basic training. In this training video, you will learn all the basic standard operating procedures used within Bravo Squadron so you can effectively work with us, attend official events, and take your first step towards ranking up to Petty Officer 3. In this video, we will cover basic weapon handling and discipline, basics of solo and team CQB, deploying flashbangs and other throwables, basic breaching procedures, along with other topics. Once you have finished watching this video and you feel that you have a general understanding of our SOPs, you can then attend Basic Qualification where we will practice and demonstrate these procedures to our training staff. Once completed, you will be officially basic trained and you will have the ability to attend official events along with other events. With all that being said, let's get started. Section 1. Basic Weapon Handling and Light and Laser Discipline. Weapon Handling and Discipline. Members of Bravo Squadron will refrain from flagging fellow teammates and secured non-combatants and hostiles. What we mean by flagging is pointing your muzzle at something. So, avoid pointing your muzzle at anything or anyone you don't intend to shoot. This is primarily, for the purposes of ready or not, is going to be your fellow teammates. We highly suggest that you set your low ready to a button that is very convenient and easy for you to toggle. We also suggest you set your low ready to toggle. This will make it a lot easier for you to easily put your gun into a low ready in the event that you don't want to be pointing your gun at somebody but you need to be facing them. Most notably, this is going to be when you are in the back of a stack. Instead of pointing your gun at the back of your buddy's head, put it in a low ready. So again, just to reiterate, always avoid, when possible, again, it's a video game, so sometimes it can be hard, but always avoid pointing your muzzle at your fellow teammates. Also, always keep your weapons on semi-auto, especially during official events. Now, during casual play, if you want to run full auto, have at it, but especially during official events, always have your guns on semi-auto. We don't need to be spraying rooms and overpenning walls and potentially killing civvies just because you think it's Call of Duty. It's not Call of Duty. Keep your guns on semi-auto. Ammunition discipline. Maintain a high capacity of ammunition in your weapons at all times. Generally, it is best practice to reload your weapon when you believe the magazine has reached roughly half capacity. Now, obviously, you are not going to be able to round count, so you're going to have to do this by feel. So, in the event that you think that the magazine has reached roughly around half capacity, just go ahead and reload the gun. Also, avoid doing mag checks. If you hold R, you can do a mag check where your guy basically takes the magazine out of his rifle or his pistol, kind of waves it around in the air and feels it, and it will tell you roughly how much you have in your magazine. Avoid doing that. It's a massive waste of time. The time spent doing a mag check is better spent just reloading the gun. Inevitably, what happens is that you will be a point man and you'll do a mag check, and while you're doing a mag check, some dude will run out and shove a pistol in your face and you won't be able to do a damn thing about it because you're sitting there waving a magazine around in your hand and it's not in your gun. So the golden rule here is, when in doubt, just reload the gun. If you think you need to reload the gun, reload it. Light and laser discipline. Only employ white lights and lasers when needed. Refrain from leaving lights and lasers on, as this can be very distracting and blinding to others in the stack, especially when under nods. If you need it, use it. When you don't, turn it off. A lot of people have the bad habit of running around and leaving their white light or their lasers, whether that's IR or the visible laser, just constantly on. This is, again, very distracting, especially to the point man, and especially when everyone is under nods or night vision. So the golden rule here is, when it comes to lights and lasers, when you need it, turn it on. When you don't, turn it off. Section 2. Room and door anatomy. Major room shapes. There are 4 major room shapes that we are going to focus on in this video: square or box-shaped rooms, rectangular rooms, linear rooms, and L-shaped rooms. All of these should be pretty self-explanatory, assuming that you are able to pass first grade geometry. A square, or sometimes referred to as a box-shaped room, is exactly that. It is a room that is roughly square in shape, meaning it is as wide as it is deep. A rectangular room is, again, pretty self-explanatory. It's a room that is roughly rectangular in shape, meaning it is significantly wider than it is deeper. Common rectangular shaped rooms are going to include classrooms, conference rooms, etc. Linear rooms, or sometimes referred to as tubular rooms, are going to be rooms that are significantly longer or deeper than they are wide. Generally speaking, most linear rooms are going to be hallways or corridors. However, there are rooms in the traditional sense that are also going to be linear, although rare. An important distinction to note between a linear room and a rectangular room is, although a linear room and a rectangular room are, geometrically speaking, virtually identical, they need to be differentiated because their point of entries are very different. In a rectangular room, your point of entry, which in this game is primarily going to be a doorway, is on one of the side walls, as opposed to a linear room where the doorway or point of entry is on one of the end walls. This drastically changes your perspective into the room, and in CQB, perspective is very, very important. Generally speaking, linear rooms are very easy to clear because you can clear virtually 100% of that room from outside the threshold or the doorway. However, for the same reasons that is very easy to clear, they are very dangerous to move through because you are in a very compressed environment, meaning you have very little lateral movement and your only real means of movement or travel is either forward or backward. Generally, the opposite is true with a rectangular room. Due to the deep, hard corners, you cannot clear as much of the room from outside the threshold or the doorway, which can pose more of a challenge to clear upon making entry. However, once you do make entry, you are afforded much more lateral movement within the room as opposed to a linear room. An L-shaped room is exactly that. It is a room that is roughly L-shaped. Now, most L-shaped rooms are going to be hallways or corridors that break off at a 90 degree either left or right. However, there are rooms that are also L-shaped rooms. The most common one that most of you are going to be familiar with is going to be that of a hotel room, where you have the small corridor that leads to the main hotel room where all the beds are and all that breaks off either left or right. And those are the four major room shapes. Now, there are other important room shapes such as T-shapes and cross sections. However, these will be discussed in later training iterations. Center-fed rooms versus corner-fed rooms. A center-fed room is a room in which the doorway is located in roughly the center of the wall it is attached to. Now, it doesn't have to be perfectly in the center, it just has to be located nearer to the center of the room rather than towards one of the corners. Also, generally speaking, a center-fed room, the doorway will feed into roughly the center of the room, although this is dependent on the room shape, of course. A corner-fed room is a room in which the door is located near one of the corners of the wall it is attached to rather than the center. Again, the doorway doesn't necessarily have to be directly on the corner. If the door is located closer to one of the corners of the wall rather than the center, it is a corner-fed room. Corner-fed room anatomy and terminology. Corner-fed rooms have both a shallow side and a deep side. The shallow side of the room is the same side of the room in which the door is located. It is called the shallow side because from the doorway, the depth of that side of the room is very shallow. The deep side of the room is the opposite side of the room in which the door is located. It is called the deep side of the room because, again, from the doorway, that side of the room is deep. This is also the side of the room in which the room feeds into. Meaning, if the deep side of the room is the left-hand side of the room, that is a corner-fed room that feeds left. Basic room angles. There are four major room angles that we are going to discuss in this section: the 180 degrees, the 45 degrees, the 90 degree, and something we will call the narrow. It is critically important that you understand all these angles because we are going to be referencing them a lot in the upcoming sections, both on solo and Team CQB, so pay attention. Easy corners versus hard corners. There are generally two types of corners within a room: easy corners and hard corners. These are very easily differentiated. An easy corner is a corner within a room that you can see and therefore clear from outside of the room, i.e. you can see it from the doorway. A hard corner is a corner within a room in which you cannot see into from outside the doorway. Therefore, you must enter the room at least slightly in order to see into that corner. Generally speaking, the easy corners within a room are going to be the deep back corners of the room, and the hard corners are going to be the corners directly to the right and left of the doorway. Now, this isn't always the case, of course, depending on the room type, whether it's a corner-fed room, center-fed room, etc., the room geometry, how deep those corners are, and how deep those angles are, of course. However, rest assured, again, if you can see the corner from outside of the doorway, it is an easy corner. If you cannot see the corner from outside the doorway, it is a hard corner. Alright, so now let's go back to those major room angles. Now, before I start defining each angle, I want to make an important note here. And that is that each of these angles are always relative to your point of entry, which in this game is almost always going to be a doorway. But whether you are entering or viewing into a room from a window, a doorway, a hole in the wall, every one of these angles is always relative to that. The 180 degrees. The 180-degree angles are going to be the angles directly right and left of the doorway or other point of entry. Essentially, they are the immediate angles that run along the same wall in which the door is attached to. Generally speaking, these will be the most dangerous angles within a room because they very commonly will lead to a hard corner. Whether that's one hard corner or two hard corners will depend on the room shape and whether or not the room is a center-fed or a corner-fed, which means you may have to enter the room and therefore commit to the room at least slightly in order to clear that 180-degree angle or angles. The 45-degree angles. The 45-degree angles are exactly that. They are 45 degrees from the doorway or your point of entry, both on the right side of the room and the left side of the room. Depending on the room shape, they may correspond with the deep back corners of the room. These are notable angles because they provide a flanking perspective into the room. The 90-degree angle. The 90-degree angle is exactly 90 degrees from the doorway or your point of entry. So basically it is everything directly forward of the doorway. This is a critical angle because at this point you have essentially split the room in half, and depending on the circumstances and the context, can allow you to begin to isolate the other half of the room. It is also critical for the fact that as you begin to work past that 90 degree and towards the opposite 45 degree angle, you are losing control, i.e. visibility over the other half of the room. This is critical to keep in mind during solo CQB or in single stack entries in some circumstances. The narrow. The narrow is a term we will use to describe what is essentially the 180-degree angle leading up to the door or point of entry of a room. The reason it is called the narrow is that from this angle, your exposure and your visibility into the room is very narrow, i.e. you can only see a very small slice of that room, and somebody would have to be standing in that very small slice of that room in order to see you. This is a critical angle for several reasons. Number one, this is the beginning of your exposure and visibility into the room. 2, this is generally where we want to approach a door from, if possible, and where we want to begin our clearance. 3, from this angle, we can possibly gather some initial information about the room, such as is the door open or closed, is it a positive corner fed, etc. And 4, this is generally the angle we will bail to in the event that we need to bail away from the threshold. So as a general rule, the narrow is where we approach doors from and where we begin to work a room. Door anatomy. Strong side versus weak side. Doors have both a strong side and a weak side. For now, we are going to start with the weak side. For the purposes of ready or not, because all doors open inward in this game, the weak side of the door will always be the handle or the knob side of the door. The reason it is called the weak side is because as you are opening the door from that side, the door is providing you concealment from the angles that you would otherwise be exposed to within the room as the door is opening. But at the same time, it is blocking your visibility to those angles as well, so it's a double-edged sword. So again, the weak side of the door is always going to be the handle or the knob side of the door because it's going to provide you concealment while also blocking your visibility into the room as you work the door. The strong side of the door is going to be the opposite side of the door. And again, for the purposes of ready or not, this will always be the hinge side of the door. The reason it is called the strong side of the door is because the moment that door is peeked open, your exposure into the room and your visibility into that room immediately begins. I.e., the moment that door is peeked open, you can immediately see into the room, and if someone was standing in the angles in which you can see, he could potentially see you. As a general rule, the individual who is going to be peeking and opening the door should be on the weak side of the door when possible. Because from the weak side, the door will provide the individual working the door concealment as he works the door. The individual's responsibility on the strong side of the door is to be ready to immediately cover those angles that he is going to be exposed to the moment that door is peeked open, along with giving commands to the number 2 man, i.e. the person on the weak side of the door, when to open the door, when to peek the door, etc., and to check for traps because in this game he has the best angle to do so. But this will all be covered in more detail in Section 4, Team CQB. Defining apexes. An apex is any wall, quote unquote, that breaks off at a 90 degree. The corner made by that 90 degree break off is considered an apex. Understanding apexes is critically important because as a general rule, we will try to orient ourselves around apexes whenever possible in CQB. But for now, we'll keep things simple and just talk about threshold apexes. A threshold or a door frame has 2 apexes, both a left and a right-hand apex, because both the left and the right-hand side of the door frame is a wall that breaks off at a 90 degree. These threshold apexes are very important because we are going to orient and orbit around these apexes as we sweep and work a room, which is exactly what we are going to cover in the next section. Section 3, Introduction to Solo CQB. We are first going to start off by teaching you basic solo CQB principles and techniques because ultimately solo CQB is the foundation to team CQB. Once you understand how to clear a room solo, it actually becomes much easier to add other individuals to a stack, especially if they understand how to clear rooms solo themselves and assuming they've been taught in the same system. Virtually all the techniques and principles in solo CQB equally apply to team CQB. Also, no matter what anyone tells you, even within a team context, you will clear rooms solo. That is just the nature of the beast when it comes to CQB. Even if you have an entire team behind you, you will be put in the situation and commonly put in a situation where you will have to clear an entire room solo or at least the majority of a room solo. So get used to the idea. Approaching a closed doorway. When possible, we always want to approach a doorway from the narrow as to limit our exposure to the doorway, even if the door is closed. As you approach the door, always keep your muzzle oriented towards the door, preferably towards the doorknob. If you are approaching the doorway from the strong side of the door, we are generally going to cross over to the weak side of the door. Because this is solo CQB, you are going to be the one to peek and open up the door, and as we discussed beforehand, generally speaking, we want to work the door from the weak side. There are several caveats to this, or actually many. However, the biggest one that I'm going to discuss here is that we wouldn't do that in the event that the narrow on the weak side of the door is too shallow, i.e. it's not long enough for you to at least be able to take 3 steps backwards from the door. Regardless, let's go ahead and talk about how to properly cross a closed doorway. Crossing a doorway properly. Once you've made the decision to cross over to the opposite side of the door, you will keep your muzzle oriented towards the door, ideally towards the doorknob. As you begin to cross over to the opposite side, maintain a fairly linear path. The biggest mistake to avoid here is doing a huge rainbow around the door. Even though the door is closed, this is still a danger area and we want to spend as little time as possible in front of the doorway because it is dangerous. Due to geometry, the bigger of a rainbow you do around the door, the longer you will be standing in front of the door, which is dangerous. Also, this is just generally inefficient. Your path from one side of the door to the other should be fairly linear and you should only step off just as much as you need to clear your muzzle from the doorway and no more. This is more efficient and thus faster and limits the amount of time you spend in front of the doorway. As you cross the door, always keep your muzzle oriented towards the doorway/doorknob. Cross until you've reached the opposing narrow and stepped off the doorway about 2 steps. Working the door. Once you've made the decision to work the door, go ahead and approach the door and only get just as close as you need to in order to get the peek option at the doorknob. Avoid getting too close to the door because, again, being in front of the door is a danger area, so we want to be as far away from the door as possible when we work it. Once ready, peek the door and immediately back off roughly 2 steps away from the doorway. You don't need to run a mile away from the door, just roughly 2, maybe 3 steps. But at the same time, you don't want to be standing in front of the door as you peek it, because that exposure you may have to that little crack in the door may be enough to draw fire. Once you've peeked the door, because you're working solo, it's time for you to check for traps, which you have to do. Reapproach the doorway and using your leans, lean just enough around the door to check the threshold for a wire. If clear, reapproach the doorway just enough so that way you can get the open door option on the high center of the door. Once ready, open the door and then back off roughly 2 steps away from the door. We do this for the same reasons we do it when peeking the door. At this point, it's time to start working the room. Working the angles and orbiting the apex. Once you are ready to work the room, you are going to orient yourself around your closest apex, i.e. the same side apex of the door you are on. So if you are on the left-hand side of the door, you are going to orient yourself around the left-hand apex. Your focus should be along the edge of that door frame/apex, and as you begin to take steps and work your angles, that is what you are going to orbit around. As you begin to work the room, you are going to use the major room angles that you learned in the previous sections as checkpoints. From the weak side narrow, you cannot see into the 180-degree corner obscured behind the doorway, so at this point it is time to start working towards the 45-degree angle. Work towards the next angle in 1 to 2 step sections, using your leans to your advantage. We highly suggest that you set your leans to toggle, and with buttons that are easily accessible, which is typically going to be Q and E for most people. Trust us, this will make your life significantly easier when it comes to working your angles and while performing other tasks as well. Once you've reached the 45 degree, it is time to start working towards the 90. So begin working towards the 90 again in 1 to 2 step sections until you've reached the 90 degree. Once you've reached the 90 degree, it is time to work towards the opposing 45 degree. Once that's reached, your final checkpoint is going to be the opposing 180 degree corner. If it's a hard corner, you're going to have to step into the room slightly and lean around the door frame in order to see into and clear the 180 degree corner. If the room is a center fed or a deeper corner fed, meaning that there's enough room between the door and the wall that there potentially could be someone hiding behind the door, enter the room slightly and use the edge of the door as a new apex and work it the same way until you've cleared the angles behind the door. Once clear, you can move on to the next doorway. Proper distance management from the apex. An important note when working your angles and orbiting your apex is to have proper distance management from your apex. In general, you neither want to be too sucked up, i.e. too close to your apex, nor do you want to be too stepped off the apex, i.e. too far away. There are exceptions, of course, but as a general rule, you want to maintain a distance where your muzzle is a few inches away from the apex, roughly 6 inches or so. I know it's a video game and you have no kinesthetic awareness, so it might be hard to get this exact distance. However, think about keeping your muzzle around 6 inches away from the apex. This will ensure that you are neither crowding your apex or too stepped off. Being too close to the apex presents multiple issues. Number one, it makes it harder for you to work your angles. And number two, in this game, you're going to find yourself going to high readies at the most inconvenient time. Being too stepped off your apex also poses challenges. The main one being it makes it harder for you to manage your exposure, but it also provides issues during team contexts as well. Section 4, Introduction to Team CQB. We are now going to move on to Team CQB. Now, for simplicity's sake, we are primarily going to talk about a two-man team, because even if you are in a full stack, generally speaking, the number one man and the number two man are going to have the most important jobs and the most jobs. Also, most jobs and problems are handled in pairs of two when it comes to CQB. So for the purposes of this BT, we are going to focus on the two-man buddy pair. Working doors and team communication. Approaching the doorway. When approaching a doorway as a team, you should, if possible, approach the door from the narrow for the same reasons we already learned. If it's appropriate to double stack the door, the number one man, i.e. the man in the very front of the line, is going to cross the doorway onto the opposite side of the door. The same principles of crossing a door that you already learned in the solo CQB section also apply here. Once the number one man crosses over to the other side of the door, you are now what's called double stacked, meaning you have team members on both sides of the door. When double stacked, the teammate on the strong side of the door is going to be known as the number one man. The teammate on the weak side of the door is going to be known as the number two man. The reason that the teammate on the strong side of the door is known as the number one man is because the moment that door is peeked open, he is going to be the first one who is going to be exposed into the room. So just to quickly reiterate, the number one man is the teammate on the strong side of the door, and the number two man is the teammate on the weak side of the door. Working the door. When a team is double stacked on the door, the number two man, i.e. the person on the weak side of the door, is always going to be the one who both peeks the door and opens the door. However, he only does these actions when explicitly told to do so by the number one man. So the number one man, i.e. the teammate on the strong side of the door, tells the number two man when to peek the door and when to open the door, and the number two man peeks and opens the door only after told to do so by the number one man. The job of the number one man is to tell the number two man when to work the door, to be immediately ready to cover the angles that he is going to be exposed to the moment that door is opened, and to check for traps. The job of the number two man is to be ready to work the door when told to do so by the number one man. The sequence to working a door is as follows. When the entire team is stacked up on the door and the number one man and the number two man are ready to work the door, when the number one man is ready, he will tell the number two man to peek the door. At this point, the number two man peeks the door and then backs off the door slightly. The number one man immediately covers and clears those angles that he is exposed to within the room. Once clear, his next job is to check for traps. If clear of traps, the number one man will call clear traps or just simply clear. If the door is trapped, it is the responsibility of the number one man or whoever spotted the trap to make it blatantly clear that the door is trapped. At this point, the team will either completely bail away from that doorway and look for another point of entry, or the trap will have to be disarmed before making entry. We will discuss how we disarm traps in a later section. After checking for traps, the number one man, when he's ready, will tell the number two man to open the door. At this point, the number two man opens the door and again backs off the door slightly. At this point, the door is opened and it's time to work the room. The principles that you learned in solo CQB on how you sweep a room apply here. The number one man and the number two man are going to orient themselves and orbit around their respective apexes, using the major room angles as checkpoints as they sweep the room. The main difference here is that the number one man is going to sweep one half of the room, and the number two man is going to sweep the other half of the room, and they're both going to meet and pause at the 90-degree angle. Once the number one man and the number two man meet at the 90-degree, assuming that there's no hostile civilians or other problems to deal with, it is time to make a decision on how to make entry. Either the number one or the number two man can make an entry call, and both the number one and number two man have equal say in this decision. If the situation is complicated and the number one and number two man disagree on how to make entry, they must discuss it and come to a conclusion at the threshold before making entry. It is very important that the number 1 and the number 2 man are on the same page as to how they are going to make entry into the room, because that initial entry into the room is by far the most dangerous point of clearing a room. To ensure that the number 1 and the number 2 men are on the same page and that there is no confusion between the two as to how they are going to make entry, we have very specific SOPs on how the number 1 man and the number 2 man communicate with each other before making entry into the room. Entry communication. As stated before, either the number 1 man or the number 2 man can make an entry call once they meet at the 90 degree. An entry call is a simple and very brief description as to how they are going to make entry into the room and who is going to be the first one into the room. Some examples of entry calls are as follows: cross on me, cross on you, J-hook on me, J-hook on you. When making an entry call, you always list the method of entry first, and then you say who you want to make the initial entry. The one making initial entry meaning the first person to enter the room. So when you say on me, it means you are going to be the first one to enter the room. And when you say on you, it means that the person you are working the door with is going to make the initial entry. Once an entry call is made, the one receiving the entry call is then going to repeat the call, assuming that he agrees with it. For example, if your teammate says, cross on me, you will confirm with cross on you. Before we go any further, we need to revisit the roles of the number 1 and the number 2 man. Up until now, the number 1 and the number 2 man were defined by their positioning at the door, i.e. the number 1 man being on the strong side of the door and the number 2 man being on the weak side of the door. However, once an entry call is made, this very well may change. Once an entry call is made and it is agreed upon, the number 1 man and number 2 man are no longer defined by their position on the door. It is now defined by who is the first one and the second one through the door. So the first one who is going to enter the room now becomes the number 1 man, and the second person to enter the room becomes the number 2 man. So for example, if you were originally the number 2 man on the door, but the entry call has you entering the room first, you now become the number 1 man. It is very important that you understand this so that way there is no confusion when you go to make entry. Now with that important clarification out of the way, let's go back to our entry SOPs. So once an entry call is made, the one receiving the entry call is going to confirm that entry call, assuming again that he agrees with it. After the entry call is confirmed, when the number 2 man is ready for the number 1 man to enter the room, he will simply say move. At this point, and only at this point, does the number 1 man enter the room. It is very important that this happens in this order so that way the number 2 man knows exactly when that number 1 man is going to enter the room, so that way he can follow close behind. It is critical that the number 2 man enter the room nearly simultaneously with the number 1 man so he can cover the number 1's back. The number 1 man is completely reliant on his number 2 to cover his back from the opposite hard corner if it exists. This is why ultimately the number 2 man has control over when the entry is made, because if he knows when the number 1 man is going to make entry because he told him when to do so, he can better time his entry with the number 1. So an example of our entry communication SOPs would be as follows: cross on me, cross on you, move. We will, of course, have many examples of this in this video. Basic entry methods. In general, there are going to be 2 ways we are going to enter a room, either using J-hooks or cross entries. A J-hook is where you are going to hook through the doorway and then run along the same wall you are attached to external of the room. Imagine your path being that of a J through the doorway, hence J-hook. A cross entry is the exact opposite. You are going to enter the room and cross towards the opposite side wall you are attached to external to the room, hence cross entry. Generally speaking, when we are double stacked on the door and ready to make entry, cross entries tend to be the default. And J-hooks tend to be more utilized during single stack entries, which is what we're going to talk about next.
Clear traps. Open.
Okay, cross on you.
Cross on me.
Move. Okay, peek. Clear traps. Open.
Cross on you.
Cross on me.
Move.
All right, J-hook on me.
J-hook on you. Move.
Single stack entries. When a team is single stacked on a door, it means that the entire team is stacked up on one side of the door rather than on both sides of the door. There are many reasons why you would prefer to single stack a door rather than double stack it. The two main ones being A, if the door is already open, therefore you do not cross a open doorway like you would a closed doorway. That would be exceedingly dangerous. The second reason being is that if the narrow on the opposing side of the door is too shallow, therefore making it a dangerous angle to be in. As a general rule, if you cannot take 3 or 4 steps back away from the doorway from the narrow, that angle is too shallow. As the point man or the number 1 man in a single stack, you basically have full control and responsibility over the door. In this situation, this is going to be virtually identical as to how you would work a door and sweep a room solo. The main difference being is that as you're about to take the 180-degree corner, it is best to make entry using a J-hook and take that corner so that way your number 2 man can also enter the room and take the opposing corner, assuming that this room is a center-fed room or a deeper corner-fed, deeper meaning that there's enough room behind the door to allow someone to hide behind it. If the room is a corner-fed room and the distance between the door and the wall is shallow enough where you're not concerned that there could be somebody hiding in the angles concealed by the door, you can go ahead and just take that 180-degree corner like you normally would in solo CQB by just simply leaning through the threshold, hugging your apex, and taking the 180-degree. After that, making entry. Like I already stated, in a single stack, the point man or the number 1 man has absolute responsibility and control over the door, meaning he's completely responsible for working the door, peeking it, checking for traps, opening the door, and clearing the majority of the room. As a result, once the team is fully stacked up on the door and ready to go, he has no need to communicate his actions to the rest of the team, meaning he doesn't have to say or ask anybody to peek the door, open the door, etc. The only caveats to this, however, are obviously if the door is trapped, and 2, once you are about to take that 180-degree corner, it is best practice to say moving to tell your number 2 man that you're about to make entry into the room. General entry concerns. As a general rule, upon making entry, you should always try to move along a wall. This keeps the team online, which avoids friendly fire and avoids the potential of a team member getting dispositioned. In an empty shoot house, this is easy to do. However, in reality, when you're working with actual rooms, a lot of times there will be furniture and other obstacles along those walls, so you're going to have to go around them. But the principle still remains the same. You should still try to hug walls as best as you can as you are making entry. Also, as you are making entry, you should avoid over-penetrating the room. What I mean by that is you do not need to enter the room and then push all the way into the deep corner of the room. You only need to push far enough into the room to clear the doorway and to allow for adequate space for follow-on teammates. In a 2-man team, all you need to do is push far enough into the room to clear the doorway so your number 2 man can make entry, and that's it. This will limit your exposure to follow-on danger areas within the room, such as open doorways and adjacent rooms. General stack positioning. When the team is double stacked on a door, we will utilize something called heavy stacking the overwhelming majority of the time. What heavy stacking is that it means the majority of the team is stacked up on one side of the door. So for example, if we have a 6-man stack, only 1 or 2 team members will be on one side of the door, and the other 4 or 5 team members will be on the opposing side. Whether we have 1 or 2 team members on the opposing side of the door will depend on whether or not we need to hold fort security or not. If we need to hold fort security, then 2 team members will cross because 1 team member has to work the door and the other will hold fort security. If fort security is a non-issue, then only 1 team member will cross the door. We utilize heavy stacking for a few reasons. Number 1, it simplifies entry. If the team is split stacked, meaning one half of the team is stacked up on one side of the door and the other half on the other side, once the number 1 and number 2 man make entry, it becomes very confusing as to the order in which the other teammates make entry. However, if the team is heavy stacked, once the number 1 and number 2 man make entry, the rest of the team just follows a single file line into the room. So it's hard to mess it up. Also, by utilizing heavy stacking, this limits the amount of people who need to cross the closed threshold, which is a good thing. Section 5. Deployment of Flashbangs. Who deploys Flashbangs? Flashbangs should always be deployed by the man directly behind either the number 1 or the number 2 man. The number 1 or the number 2 man, if we are double stacked, should never deploy the flashbang. Their job is to hold security on the door while the flashbang is being prepped and then work the door once the flashbang is ready. If the number 1 or number 2 man was to prep the flashbang, this puts the team in great danger because if a hostile decided to open the door and walk through the threshold, you would be absolutely screwed because you have a flashbang in your hand rather than your rifle. So again, the man directly behind the number 1 or the number 2 man is the one who preps the flashbang, never the number 1 or number 2 man themselves. Alternatively, if we wish to get 2 flashbangs into the room simultaneously, flashbangs can be prepped on both sides of the door if the team wishes. Deployment of flashbangs. The decision to deploy a flashbang is made by either the number 1, number 2 man, or the team leader. The order to prep a flashbang is going to be along the lines of prep a flashbang, prep this room, etc. Once this call is made, the man directly behind either the number 1 or number 2 man on the heavy side of the door is going to equip a flashbang. He will then turn roughly 90 degrees and pull the pin. You have to look away from the guy directly in front of you because if you are staring at his back, you will not be able to pull the pin because the flashbang goes into some sort of high ready. Don't ask me, ask the developers. At this point, while staying as close as he can to the man in front of him, he's going to step around and use his leans until he gets a good clear view of the door. It is very important that you stay close to the man in front of you and that you do not step out too far as to not be exposed the moment the door is opened. However, you must have a good angle on the door as to be ready to throw the flashbang the moment they open that door. Once you are in position to throw the flashbang, and only when you are in position to throw the flashbang, you will call set. By calling set, you are telling the number 1 and number 2 man that you are in position and ready to deploy the flashbang and that they can begin to proceed to work the door. At this point, the number 1 and number 2 man will begin to work the door. Please note that all door working procedures and SOPs still apply. The moment that the door is fully opened, the flashbang is thrown into the room. You will then immediately get back into your position in the stack, get your rifle out, and prepare to make entry. Once the flashbang detonates, the number 1 and or number 2 man will work the room as they normally would. Although we discussed this in terms of using flashbangs, which is what we normally use, all these principles remain the same no matter what type of throwable we are throwing through the doorway, whether it's gas, flashbangs, 9-bangers, etc.
Alright, let's prep this room.
Set.
Moving.
Let's prep this room.
Set.
Moving.
Alright, let's prep this room.
Alright, set.
Peek. Clear trap, open. Cross on me.
Loss on you. Move.
Section 6. Breaching Procedures and Disarming Traps. General Manual Breaching Principles. For our purposes, manual breaching is all types of breaching that are non-explosive. Shotgun breaching, ram breaching, lockpicking, etc. You will notice that a lot of the same principles you learned in the deployment of flashbangs section also apply here, so there is a lot of carryover. All breaching is done from behind or next to either the number 1 or the number 2 man. The number 1 and the number 2 man should never be the ones performing a breach for the same reasons why they should never be the ones deploying flashbangs. Their responsibility is to holding security on the door. The order for a manual breach is simply breacher up, and this can be called by either the number 1, number 2 man, or the team leader. Generally speaking, especially during official events, we are running dedicated breachers, secondary breachers, and sometimes tertiary breachers. Once the breacher up call is made, the breacher will then equip his breaching tool, which is either going to be a breaching shotgun or a ram. We will discuss specific breaching procedures for both shotguns and rams here momentarily. The breacher will then approach the door, staying as close as he can to either the number 1 or the number 2 man. Once he is in position to immediately breach the door when told to do so, he will then call breacher set or simply set. When the number 1 and number 2 man are ready, they will call breach, and the breacher will then breach the door, bail away from the door, and get back in the stack. Shotgun breaching. When using a breaching shotgun, it's important that you stay as close as you can to either number 1 or number 2 man. Place the muzzle of the shotgun directly on the doorknob. It should almost seem like that your muzzle is touching the doorknob. You should not be stepped off the door. Not only is this unrealistic, but it also greatly increases your chances of accidentally shooting either your number 1 or your number 2 man. Your muzzle should be as close to that door as you can get it without going into a high ready. Once you are in position, you will call set or breacher set. When the number 1 or number 2 man calls breach, only shoot the door once. This will only open the door to roughly a 45-degree angle, which will provide you as the breacher concealment in order to bail away from the door and get back into the stack. Shooting the door twice will fully open the door, but will leave you in front of the door longer and in possibly an exposed position. After a shotgun breach, either the number 1 and or number 2 man will then immediately full swing the door. They do not have to say anything, it's just presumed that after a shotgun breach, one of them will full swing the door. After the breach, they will then work the room as they normally would. Ram breaching. The procedures used to ram breach a door over shotgun breach it are identical. The main differences are that you will have to get a little closer to the door in order to not whiff on the door with the ram. Also, because after you ram the door will full swing open, so you will have to be, as the breacher, a little bit more on your toes in order to bail away from the door and get back into the stack the moment after you breach the door. Lockpicking. The procedures to lockpick a door are virtually identical to that of breaching. The main differences is that the number 1, number 2 man or team leader will specifically call for a lockpick. He'll do so by saying breacher, lockpick this door, or simply just saying let's pick this door. The breacher will then approach the door, equip his lockpick, and begin picking the door. He has no need to say set or ask for permission to do so, he just begins picking the door. Once the door is unlocked, he will back away from the door, get back in the stack, and say the door is unlocked. At that point, the number 1 and or number 2 men will then begin to work the door as they normally would.
Locked. Breacher up.
Set.
Breach. Moving.
Locked. Breacher up.
Breacher set.
Breach. Moving. Alright, peek.
Locked. Breacher up.
Breach is set.
Breach.
Explosive breaching procedures. The call for an explosive breach is made by the number 1, number 2 man, or the team leader. Nearly all the same principles in manual breaching apply to explosive breaching. The main difference being that, unlike in a manual breach where the number 1 man and the number 2 man have ultimate control over the breach, in an explosive breach, the breacher has control over the breach. Meaning, when everybody is ready, the breacher calls when the breach happens. When an explosive breach is called up, the breacher will equip his C2 and approach the door. Staying as close as he can to either the number 1 man or the number 2 man, he will then place the charge on the door. Once the charge is placed, he and the rest of the stack will back away from the door within reason. Once the team is ready and the breacher is in a safe position deep in the stack with detonator in hand, the breacher will call, "I have control." If the number 1 and number 2 man are ready, they will confirm with, "You have control." At this point, the breacher will call with something along the lines of breaching, burning, turning steel, etc., and then he will detonate the charge. Once the charge is detonated, the number 1 and the number 2 man and the rest of the stack will reapproach the door, and they will begin to work the room as normal.
Locked. Explosive breach up.
I have control.
You have control.
Breaching. Door locked. Explosive breach up.
I have control.
You have control.
Turning steel.
I have control.
You have control.
Internal breach, breaching.
Moving.
Disarming traps. When working a door, if the number 1 man or anybody who spots a trap, they will call trap. It is very important that you make it very obvious that the door is trapped. If the decision is made to disarm the trap, the number 1, number 2 man, or team leader will call for a breacher to disarm the trap. The breacher will then approach the door, staying close to the number 1 or number 2 man. He will crouch down and then begin to disarm the trap. Once the trap is disarmed, he will back off, get back into position in the stack, and call that the trap is disarmed. Again, the number 1 and or number 2 man should not be the one to disarm the trap. Their job is to hold security on the door. Once the trap is disarmed, the number 1 and number 2 man can begin to work the door as normal.
Alright, peek. Trap. Breacher, disarm trap.
Disarming trap.
Trap disarmed.
Alright, full swing.
Section 7. Technician and Chemlight usage. For our purposes, a technician is anybody who is running a mirror gun. The call to mirror a door is simply mirror up or tech up. The tech will then equip his mirror gun, approach the door, staying close to his number 1 or number 2 man, crouch down, and begin to mirror the door. As you are mirroring the door, you have 4 main priorities. Number 1, is the door trapped or not? Number 2, armed suspects, civilians, and unknowns. An unknown is somebody you do not know whether or not they are hostile or not. So let's say you have somebody standing behind a large desk and you cannot see their hands, therefore you don't know if they are armed. He would be an unknown. Number 3, room type, whether it's a center fed, corner fed, if it's a corner fed, which way it feeds, etc. And then number 4, danger areas, open doors, dead space, closed doors, etc. Keep your descriptions brief and to the point. You do not need to write an entire wiki page on the room. Just hit those 4 main points. Chemlight usage. For our purposes, Chemlights are used to mark rooms that have had their secondary searches or SSE done, sensitive site exploitation. Especially during official events, many times we will first clear an entire structure and then go back and collect all the evidence and report the bodies. During secondary searches and SSE, if you've collected all the weapons and reported all the bodies within a room, you drop a Chemlight near the door to let everybody know that that room has had its secondary searches and SSE completed. This allows other teammates to pass by the door, see the Chemlight, and know that the room has already been searched. And that concludes Bravo Squadron's basic training. Your next step is to attend Basic Qualification, where you're able to ask any questions you may have, practice everything you've learned in this video, and demonstrate basic proficiency in all of our SOPs. Once you demonstrate basic knowledge and proficiency with our SOPs, you will then officially be basic trained and you'll be able to attend official events. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to training staff or higher leadership.